In June of this year, Shopify announced a suite of changes to the online store experience that they called Online Store 2.0. As I addressed in my Online Store 2.0 What You Need to Know video, this wasn't a fundamental change to the whole Shopify platform, it was just a bunch of updates mixed together into a single release. I've done my best to cover each of these updates within its own video, but what I'm finding is that this idea of Online Store 2.0 is still confusing some viewers, and I think I may have found the culprit. The new Dawn theme from Shopify has been touted as the standard for Online Store 2.0 themes, and if you look at the code, it's coded very differently to the previous debut theme. That's why in this video, we're going to break down the new Dawn theme, and in the process, break down some misconceptions around Online Store 2.0. Before we dive into looking at the Dawn theme code, I wanted to clear up a few misconceptions you guys have shown me in the comments of my YouTube and Skillshare videos. The most common misconception is that Online Store 2.0, and I guess you could say Online Store 1.0, are some sort of mutually exclusive systems, but this is not the case. In my video on JSON templates, we saw that we could update any theme, even a theme created long before Online Store 2.0, to use JSON templates, therefore giving it some of the features of Online Store 2.0. Then came the question, if we're using JSON templates instead of Liquid, doesn't that mean that Liquid is no more? Again, this is incorrect. Just because we're now using JSON for templates doesn't mean that Liquid code is gone. Rather, that code has just been moved into sections. That's it. Finally, and this is what I'll demonstrate in this video, Dawn and Online Store 2.0 are not the same thing. What I'm finding is that some of you are referring to the way things are done in Dawn as Online Store 2.0. Yes, the Dawn theme takes advantage of the features of Online Store 2.0, and as I mentioned, Online Store 2.0 represents a suite of changes and new features to the online store experience, but it doesn't mean that the way that Dawn has been built by Shopify has to dictate how you create your themes moving forward. With that being said, let's actually take a look at the structural differences that Shopify have implemented in the new Dawn theme and break down what is or isn't considered Online Store 2.0. All right, so if we go into the Dawn theme, I've got it right here as my live theme on Chris Testing Shop. If we go in here and inspect the code, the biggest difference you could say is JSON templates. Now, of course, JSON templates are an Online Store 2.0 change. And I'm pretty sure whenever Shopify are referring to Online Store 2.0 themes, they are mainly talking about the use of these JSON templates. So as we have seen in the previous versions of Shopify, these were typically 404.liquid, article.liquid, blog.liquid, instead of 404.json, article.json, blog.json, so on and so forth. Now, because we've got JSON stored in these templates, I have had the question come up a few times now whether Liquid is deprecated, whether we need to use Liquid anymore because we're now using JSON in templates. And a question like that shows a misunderstanding of what JSON actually is. JSON is just a way to store data. So if we look inside here in index.json, there's no HTML, there's no JavaScript, there's no CSS. This is just a data structure. And the reason why Shopify have changed from Liquid templates to JSON templates is when we structure our code in Liquid, like we've done in, let's have a look at a section, for instance. What you're seeing here is structure and templating. This is not storage of data. And what this allows us to do by having these JSON templates is allow us the functionality of sections everywhere. So if I open up Customize Theme in a new tab, you'll see we can add new sections in, and we can remove existing sections. We can rearrange these sections like such. And what enables that is JSON. Because we're storing it as data, we're just pulling references to these sections, and then once these sections come in, the Liquid code within those sections gets loaded. So I'm pretty sure I explained this in my video on JSON templates, but I still get the question every now and then, is JSON replacing Liquid? But simply put, JSON cannot replace Liquid, as it's just pure data. We can't actually dictate structure in terms of HTML, CSS classes, logic like cycling through blocks, if statements, all this kind of stuff. So if I found another example, all of this kind of code, it'd be impossible to shove all of this into a JSON file. So the answer to the question is 100% no. The use of JSON in the templates does not mean that Liquid is now done for and that we don't need to use it. What this does mean, and I'm pretty sure I explained this in my JSON template video, is that the code that was typically in, let's say, the article.liquid file just needs to be moved into a section. So if I go into article.json, you can see here the first section makes reference to main article. So if I go into the sections folder here and go to main article, you can see this code, which would have been typically in the article.liquid file, is now over here because we're using a JSON template. Okay, so this is an online store 2.0 feature. Templates as JSON means that we have JSON files in our template folder, but not in sections or snippets. It's just the templates folder, okay? If I close down these and go to one of the most common, or rather most important of the templates, and that is the product.json template. If we look in here, what we're referencing is the main product section. So let me go to that one, and we can see some of the complexity that's happening inside of the Dawn theme. The first thing you'll notice is this component CSS. Instead of bringing in one big style sheet in the theme.liquid file, we're bringing in all these individual CSS files within a particular section, and only when we need those CSS files. If we go into our assets folder over here and scroll down, as you can see, we've got all these different CSS files, not one CSS file or SCSS file. I want to just provide a bit of context here with a little history lesson for those of you who haven't seen the progression of how CSS has evolved through Shopify themes. But if I go back and let's go to this 16.7.0 version of Debut, and let's look at the code for that. As you can see, I'm loading up the theme.scss.liquid file. So if I scroll down here, you can find it in the assets folder. All right here, theme.scss.liquid. And what this would manifest to on the front end would just be theme.css, because SCSS and Liquid would get processed on the server side. So at the end of the day, you're getting a CSS file, but what this allowed us to do is insert Liquid variables inside our CSS file and then put that into Sass variables as well. So we could use the power of Sass, and we could include data from Liquid in the one file. So if I search for the curly braces here, you can see we are storing all of these settings from the setting object into Sass variables. And then of course we're able to use those Sass variables inside our code. So if I look for color dash text, there you can see that we're loading in that value into our CSS right here. But then of course the announcement came out that Shopify was deprecating Sass in Shopify themes. So if we scroll all the way up here, you can see the warning here: SCSS support is deprecated in themes. Convert SCSS and SCSS.liquid files to CSS or CSS.liquid for better performing online store. All right, so that was the next step by Shopify. We were still going to have .liquid, but we just weren't going to have SCSS. So if I look at Debut theme, what's the next version I have here? 17.10.0. And I click into the code there. You'll see I already have it loaded up here, the theme.css file. So if I scroll down here, you can see that we've got theme.css here, and it actually doesn't have .liquid on the end. So this is just pure CSS. This was a decision by Shopify to deprecate Sass inside of themes. So now it's just a theme.css file. And so after Shopify deprecated Sass, what that meant was we needed to process our own SCSS, and that's what I cover in my video on using Gulp with ThemeKit to process SCSS into CSS. You can check that video out. I'll link it on your screen somewhere up here. Okay. The other thing Shopify have done in Debut 17.10.0 is they've taken out the liquid variables. So this is not a theme.css.liquid file. And so where do we put in our theme settings that need to be inserted into CSS? Well, in this particular version of Debut, what they've done is they've inserted a snippet in theme.liquid called CSS variables. If I search for it right here, and I've got it right here open in another tab. Here is where we inserted all our liquid settings into different CSS variables, and then you're able to use them in conjunction with the theme.css file here. So that's how Shopify were encouraging us to use CSS right up until Online Store 2.0. But then when we moved over to Dawn, if I head back into the code here, and let's close down these and go into our assets folder, you can see we've got all of this component CSS. So we don't have one CSS file anymore. We have all of these different CSS files. And so again, if we wanted to insert liquid data into CSS, we did so in the theme.liquid, or in the case of Shopify, what they've done here in Dawn is inserted it in the theme.liquid. Here you can see we are inserting some settings here in the theme.liquid file. All right, so that was a little bit long-winded, but I thought it was important to cover a little bit of the history to give you guys context of what was going on here. So if we go back to the main products.liquid, we're including CSS where we require it. We're not including one big CSS file on the theme.liquid file. Instead, we're putting in the CSS that we require in a more modular fashion inside of our sections. This is a non-Online Store 2.0 feature. This is just a design choice by Shopify in the Dawn theme. So you don't actually have to do this. You can do one big CSS file if you want, but what Shopify seem to be doing is encouraging us to use component CSS in our themes moving forward. If I scroll down on this main product.liquid file, I want to draw your attention to here where we go into this block loop, okay? This is not an Online Store 2.0 fundamental tech change, but it is an architecture choice by Shopify to move more data out of sections and put them into blocks, therefore allowing us to rearrange different parts of our section. What I mean by that is if we go into the customizer, I've still got it open in a new tab here, and if I go into the product template, here you can see, if you remember before in previous versions of Shopify, we had just these sections here, and when you clicked on them, it went into theme settings, kind of like you can see here, and we had blocks down below. Now we've got this tree view where the blocks show up inside the same panel, and this would indicate to me from Shopify that Shopify want us to break up our section settings into different blocks, therefore allowing us to be able to rearrange them. So now I can move this piece of text underneath the product title. I can move the price to somewhere random, like down here. I can move these around, and I can also add more blocks. So it's just a design choice by Shopify to make the product page and sections in general more modular by having blocks take more of a prominent role. If I head back into the code here and we look at what's going on inside this loop here, we are going through the section blocks and we're creating a case statement based on the block type. So if the block type is text, then we're going to output whatever we store in that block. If it's title, we're going to just output the product title. There's no block settings. And we can see this matching up with what we have in the customizer. So the first one, text. If it's a style text, we have this field for what we want to put in the field here. I've put in a custom meta field using dynamic linking, but if we go down here, we've got product subtitle. If I was just to change this, just for argument's sake, to hello, it's not even how you spell hello, there we go. Now you can see that appears up there. So that is coming from a setting. But if we go to title, for instance, there's no customizable settings. That's just pulling from the product title. So if we go in here, we can start to see all this code. And this is very different to what we saw in the debut theme. Again, this is not a fundamental online store 2.0 change. All this is just a design choice by Shopify within their themes. If you want to create one big section with all your theme settings in there, feel free. But this is just one way that Shopify are encouraging us to be more modular with our sections using blocks. Heading back to our code here, if I scroll down, you might start to notice something a little bit interesting, which is these custom tags here. So we've got quantity input, which, if you understand HTML, is not a standard HTML element. Let me just expand here and we can talk a little bit more in depth about what's going on here. What we're looking at here is what's called a web component. Web components are pretty new, they're pretty cutting edge, and I haven't seen a lot of websites using them. So it's pretty interesting that Shopify have decided to use web components. What web components are essentially doing here is we can define our own HTML tag, and if we wrap that tag around certain code, then we're going to add some functionality to just the code that's inside these wrapping tags. Let me show you what I mean. So if we go into, I believe it's the global.js file in our assets, and look at that. If I search for that tag, so if I search for quantity-input in here, you'll see we have this line here, custom elements.define, followed by what that tag is, followed by this class right here. And if I scroll up, you can see that the class is defined right above it. And what this does is it applies this JavaScript functionality inside this class to this kind of pseudo HTML element. So all the functionality within this class will extend to here in the quantity input. So as you can imagine, with a quantity input, if we actually have a look at it in our theme right now, if I go into here, go to awesome sneakers, and then as you can see, as I'm pressing these buttons, the number goes up and down. That functionality is provided in this global.js file. You can identify a web component by looking for this class with a name and then extends HTML element. And everything within here is going to be scoped specifically to the code that's within this tag of quantity input. So if we look at this query selector right here, we're looking for all buttons, and then we're adding an event listener to these buttons. If we put that outside of this web component, then that would apply to every button on our entire website. But because it's inside this quantity input, which is linked to this quantity input class, this web component, we are scoping only to the code inside quantity input. So here you can see we're adding an event listener to all buttons within this component, and when a click is registered, we're going to run this event, which is going to update the value in our input. Okay? So again, this is probably one of the more complex updates that Shopify has made in terms of how they make Shopify themes in the new online store paradigm. But again, this is not an online store 2.0 feature. What this is just a design choice. You can use regular JavaScript, you can use something like Vue. You don't have to use web components in online store 2.0. So that's important to note here. That Dawn, as we've mentioned before, is not the same as Online Store 2.0. There's certain things in Dawn that aren't necessarily Online Store 2.0 things, so you don't have to use them. And Web Components is one of those examples. Obviously, there's a lot to say about Web Components. There's a lot of complexity here, so we won't go in depth into Web Components in this video, but if you want to go do some research into Web Components, I would highly recommend it. And if you have any questions on that, I might have to create some sort of resources on Web Components in the future. But for now, let's head back into our main product.liquid section here, and I'll bring your attention to the last thing I want to mention within this Dawn theme. So if I scroll down further into this section Schema, all the way down here, you can see that inside our labels and our names here, we have these weird strings here that don't actually represent the label. And what they're doing here is they're putting translations inside the section settings. So I guess this is when you're running Shopify with French language enabled, or German, or whichever language that you use apart from English is going to load up the label in that language. And we can see that by going into the locales folder here. These are all the mappings of what these relate to. So if I wanted to see the English version of this right here, actually let's go to something a little bit more obvious. Let's go into show dynamic checkout. Let me search for that inside of, so we've got en.default.json, which is for the front end, and then en.default.schema.json, which is for the customizer. That's what we're looking for. So if I click on that one, and then I search here for show dynamic checkout, let's check if that's related. So it's a bit tricky because I can't split these code editors. But if you look here, we're looking for sections.mainproduct.blocks.buybuttons.settings.showDynamicCheckout.label. So that's some heavy object nesting. But if we look, what is show dynamic checkout inside of? It's inside of settings, which is inside of buy buttons, just like we can see here, which should be inside of blocks, which should be inside of main product. So there you go. These are the mappings that relate to what goes in here. And again, this is not something you have to do. This is not a strict online store 2.0 feature. This is just a design choice by Shopify. I think it's going to increase accessibility for other people accessing the customizer in different languages. It's frustrating for somebody who's just doing it in English. You can't actually see what the label is. You have to actually go and look it up in this data structure here. So this show dynamic checkout buttons, that's going to be the label inside of this particular setting. But for us, in order to know that, we have to look it up in the schema.json lang file for our particular language, which most of the time, for most of you watching, is going to be English. So en.default. All right, so hopefully that clears up some of the myths around Online Store 2.0 and gives you a bit of an explanation around what's happening inside the Dawn theme. So to summarize the main points in this video, number one, Online Store 1.0 and 2.0 are not mutually exclusive systems, meaning that the features of Online Store 2.0 can be used in conjunction with those of 1.0. We saw this, of course, in my video on JSON templates, where we were able to modify the debut theme to utilize JSON templates. Number two, JSON does not replace Liquid. Liquid is a templating language and JSON is just a data storing format. And finally, while Dawn is Shopify's benchmark example of an Online Store 2.0 theme, Dawn is not in and of itself representative of Online Store 2.0. Hope that all makes sense there. What I'm saying is kind of nuanced, but I think it's definitely worth trying to understand. How the Dawn theme has been architected is a good indication of how Shopify would suggest we build themes in 2021 and beyond, but it's not something we have to follow to the T. If you do need any help wrapping your head around these concepts, I'd recommend joining my new Shopify Theme Developer Mastermind, where you can ask me specific questions related to Shopify theme development. You can find that at shopifythemedeveloper.com. Thanks for watching. Please give this video a like if you learned something new today, and let me know what you think in the comments below. I'll catch you on the next video.